Hello and welcome. As he guarded nuclear weapons for the US Army, he could hardly have imagined a globe-trotting career as the man who put MTV on the map. But through his sharp business sense and his understanding of youth culture, he helped to shape a generation. This week on One on One, meet MTV's pioneering spirit, Bill Roedy. The launch of MTV Arabia was a particularly exciting milestone for Bill Roedy, marking a big step in moving the iconic music channel another notch higher on the global scale. Roedy spends much of his time on the road ensuring the network reaches out to its audience according to the vision he set when he first joined MTV soon after its launch. It was a personal mission that had him meeting historic figures such as Nelson Mandela and Fidel Castro. It was his training in the US Army, says Roedy, that gave him the discipline to persist whenever the challenges became overwhelming. He managed to fend off his critics when he decided to make the issue of HIV/AIDS a key concern for the channel, and has remained a staunch advocate in the fight against AIDS ever since. Roedy's credited with leading the pioneering spirit that made music television what it is, a channel that led a generation. Bill, it's great to talk with you.
Thank you, Rose.
And I bump into you on a regular basis around the world, especially at the UN AIDS functions and so on. And I just wonder how much that's taking up your time now, the actively campaigning for HIV/AIDS awareness.
Well, I've got a demanding job running this empire of 135 channels around the world. So what I did actually for that is set up a little infrastructure. And it's right next to me. Georgia Arnold is the main person on the day-to-day job of AIDS, and I just try and dip in a little bit on a daily basis, but somehow I manage it. The other thing is I built it into the DNA really of the entire culture, so it continues. It filtrates down to all levels, so it doesn't need my involvement all the time, but it's still a very important part of my life, and I do devote at some point some part of the day every single day.
When you and I first met the very first time a few years ago in Thailand at the UN AIDS conference, I remember you sifting through your business cards to make sure you gave me the one that was in English, not in Thai. Now, I gather you have business cards in many different languages, and I wonder, you talk about the importance of localization and why it's so important to be localized.
Yeah, well, we're in 160 countries. I learned a long time ago, it's probably the most important thing, I think, in setting this whole business, to the start, which was local, because I just didn't think exporting was a sustainable business. And it was a little bit controversial at the time, because the margin shrank, it was more investment, it wasn't one product around the world, like other consumer products. So it required more money, and even to this day, less margin, because it's not one single market. But it was really, I thought, the only sustainable way to go, to vertically connect with audiences. And the great thing about this is we have this amazing array of diverse channels. So we actually use these channels to our benefit, because I call them sources of cool, or sources of influence, where we take from different parts around the world and use ideas or even programming and just kind of mix it all up globally. And I think of all the things we've done, this is really the most important thing. And I steal a line from Ted Turner ages ago. We were local before local was cool, because now everyone wants to go local, but we did it, we pioneered it, and I feel really very, very good about it.
Well, it's true. Now, you're credited with being sort of Mr. MTV, the man who spearheaded MTV's growth globally, putting it out into all these countries and making it one of the top 10 recognized brands in the world. But HIV/AIDS, as you say, became a big issue for MTV from a long time ago, about a quarter of a century now, and I wonder how hard it was keeping this on the agenda on what is essentially a music channel.
The reason we've been involved in this fight in a very visible way is because it affects young people more than anybody else, and that's our audience. And because we have literally almost 2 billion people worldwide, young people, that tune into our channel, and we'd have this vertical connection with them, and we're seen as a trusted voice, we would really be remiss if we didn't tackle this epidemic. And remember, the epidemic, the epicenter, we are distributed in those areas. Of course, it's not only Africa now, it is India, it is China, it's Eastern Europe, it's Russia, and we're in all those countries. So it's a huge global impact, it's a global epidemic, it's treatable, it's preventable, it's the worst epidemic in recorded history, and we have to be part of it.
You're a global citizen, of course. You travel a lot, and it's very much a part of your DNA now to be around the world. Growing up, though, as a child, how much were global issues a part of your family?
Well, I must say, not really too much. I mean, I grew up in a single, my mother was a single parent, and it was in South Florida, in Miami, and it wasn't very high on the income. In fact, one of the reasons why I went in the military is because I went to West Point, and that was really more about economic reasons. You know, it wasn't that I was gung-ho military necessarily. And for whatever reasons, was always very curious about life. So at a very young age, I read everything I could, including the newspapers. And I think that's one thing I learned from my mother, too, because she did as well. And I suppose, even though I didn't travel until I was really in my late teens, that was my introduction to learning about the world.
Did you know your father? Did you have any relationship with him? Did he influence your character in any way?
Well, he went to West Point, so you know, I carried on the history there, but he was a much different West Point cadet than I was. He was a very dedicated soldier. He was in World War II, he was in Pearl Harbor, and he was a career officer. And while economic reasons drove me, he did teach me certain things, you know, the discipline and the honor, I suppose, that goes with West Point. Although I never like to take myself too seriously on those issues. Even on the discipline, I kind of get away from sometimes. But I did obviously pick that up from him, and also he always reminded me to keep a sense of humor about everything.
What about your mother? You said she you know, influenced you in terms of reading a lot and finding out what's going on. You know, what are the ways, what are the qualities do you think she imparted to you?
Well, she was the guiding force. I mean, it's very tough to be a single mother, even now, certainly back then. And it certainly taught me to respect motherhood and how important motherhood is to the world, really, you know, to not only families. And I'm particularly partial to women leadership because I grew up in a household of women, and she struggled. It was not easy for her. And, you know, as a son, you always want to do what you can to help the situation. And I think, you know, she just brought those values to me that to really just keep going, even though life can be very difficult and often is very difficult. And it's carried over to today because I want to give my children everything.
Now, in terms of, you know, where you started to become more world aware when you traveled and became aware of what was out there, at what point did you realize there was a big world you wanted to explore?
Well, I started in my late teens traveling. I went to Italy, for example, and I think it just grew gradually. When I left West Point, there was so much controversy about Vietnam that I thought the only way to get the true answer, somewhat naively, I think in hindsight, was to go there. And that sort of set the stage, really. I spent a year in Asia, and even though it was a combat environment, I really enjoyed the experience, and I suppose developed my first love for local, because the Vietnamese are just, you know, some of the most incredible people in the world. They're resilient, they're strong, they're beautiful, they're giving, forgiving. I taught English to the kids, you know, on the weekends and during the nighttime, and that taught me to be, I think, really respectful at the outset of other cultures, and that's carried forward to today, because the defining, really characteristic, I believe, of our culture at MTV Networks is to respect other cultures. Respect, and when you go into a country, bring out, don't necessarily bring in, and, you know, just really treasure this amazing diversity of cultures that we have.
You're actually a decorated soldier. I should point that out. The bronze medal, I think the Air Medal, the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry, Meritorious Service Award. When you look at that side, the very structured military side, apart from the application you've used in structuring MTV, what do you think you got out of being someone part of such a rigid system?
Well, yeah, I think conversely, I tend to go the other direction. I think perhaps because I did have that strong environment of discipline. It didn't happen in my childhood, it came after, that I sometimes react against it. And I find myself often questioning authority and sometimes questioning even discipline. So, you know, what I like to have in a work environment, for example, is always never accepting no for an answer as one thing, and swimming upstream, and, you know, just because someone says it doesn't make it right, and also making it fun, which is not always the case, you know, in a military environment. So I suppose, to answer your question, it hasn't been an extension, it's been actually almost a counter reaction, if you will.
Because MTV is essentially a very disruptive technology, isn't it?
We try to be.
And in terms of music, I mean, was music a part of your life? You're you know, sort of heading up a music channel now. Music
is such a key ingredient to the world, and yes, it played a very important role in my younger life, and one of the great things about my job for the last 20 years is I haven't had to let it go. We often let it go when we're young, and I experience music every day, and I experience, again, this amazing diversity of music. I just love And that's been a huge change over the past 20 years. When we first went into this business, it was really dominated global music by, oh, I don't know, Anglo-American, a very small group of countries. And now it's much more diverse. It doesn't come from one source, and that's a healthier thing, a better thing. And boy, the music is just wonderful. It can be a unifying force. It can be a vehicle for cultural exchange, even. It brings people together. And, you know, it also elicits an emotional response. It's sometimes stronger than, oh, I don't know, political leadership, even religious leadership. So music is really a key ingredient to our life.
What did you listen to?
Well, now or then?
But then, when you were growing up, what were the
well, you know, when I grew up, it was, you know, another generation, of course. So it was pretty harmless stuff. And when rock and roll first started, it was, you know, doo-wop and then a lot of Motown. But, you know, it was a gamut of, you know, everything from, I don't know, Elvis Presley, I suppose, to Johnny Mathis. And then the Beatles came, and the whole English thing came in the 60s. And then we had, you know, rock and roll, real rock and roll. And
it's funny you say it was harmless, because it sounds like something out there now is harmful.
Well, it was, I think music by definition, because it relates so strongly to young people, is a little bit irreverent, and therefore adults, you know, feel somewhat often unsettled with it. But I think the interesting thing about rock and roll, when it started, it was very much that. And, you know, people said, oh my gosh, obviously it seems very tame by today's standards. But the people, the young people growing up then have kept music in their lives more than that generation. So rock and roll doesn't necessarily have to be the irreverence that it once was. But it still, by definition, pushes the envelope a little bit.
Well, Bill, don't go away. We're going to ask you some more questions in a moment. We take a short break here on 101. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching 101. We're talking with MTV chief and UNAIDS activist Bill Roedy. Bill, you know, I wanted to ask you about your transition from the Army into MTV. We talked a little bit about your life in the Army and your work at MTV. Now, what I wonder is what made you gravitate towards MTV, which was a very young channel at the time. It was disruptive technology. It was very unusual. What made you think you had a career there?
Well, I always loved television, and I just, you know, I don't know, the power of television, the power to reach mass groups of people, and then if you do it right, to connect. Obviously, television does a lot of wrong things. So, I don't know, I think it was just an opportunity to make a dent, if you will, change, maybe in a small way, the world.
What have been the interesting moments? What stuck in your mind from your career at MTV?
Yeah, there's been so many. I mean, it's great. I mean, when I first came to Europe to really, you know, take this MTV Europe thing further, it was late '88, early '89, and there was just this tremendous sea change of political events happening in Eastern Europe, culminating in the wall coming down in East Berlin. And I discovered there were distribution opportunities for MTV during that winter and spring, so it really went for it. So we were actually well distributed in Eastern Europe as these changes were happening. It was quite something. And East Berlin, I was actually in East Berlin. I was invited to give a speech about East meets West, and it just happened to be the same week that the wall came down. And we were going to go to a reception. We did go to a reception with the Politburo attending and great celebration, and they didn't attend. They all resigned, and that was within, oh, I don't know, 24 hours of when we actually hooked up MTV. Right. And we have this great picture of the East German soldiers on the wall with an MTV umbrella. And I think that accelerated the changes. And you know, I've had this privilege of being in Eastern Europe involved with NATO at one point, and then, you know, fast forward 20 years later with television. And again, tongue-in-cheek, not to be taken too seriously, but I realized that there was much more power and influence with television than there were with weapons.
And it's ironic, here you were, you know, a NATO soldier, but you ended up standing on the wall while it was being torn down.
Yes, yeah, there's tremendous irony in that.
And you got to travel to a number of other places. You met a number of key people. I mean, you know, you're dealing with people like Nelson Mandela and Fidel Castro. Tell me about those meetings. They're particularly interesting ones, I guess.
Well, I was very privileged. I mean, I'm privileged in this entire career. It's been just amazing. I've met, I don't know, 20 to 30 heads of state and 5 Nobel Peace Prize winners. Nelson Mandela granted me an hour session alone. It was quite something. He told me some great stories. And this was in conjunction with our launch of MTV Africa, which was a very exciting launch for me. It was our 100th channel. You could trace the roots of almost all music back to Africa. There's a great connection emotionally from Africa to the rest of the world. So, we really got into it. And South Africa, is an amazing story, going successfully from apartheid and Nelson Mandela, just sitting there with him. And forgiveness was the big thing. He told me about the prison guards that were so harsh to him, wouldn't let him wear sunglasses when he worked in the quarry, had suffered permanent eye damage. And yet, at his inaugural, the first people he invited to the inaugural were the prison guards. So he really defines forgiveness, and Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which Bishop Tutu was in charge of, really defined, I think, the key success factor for why South Africa was able to make that transition and set a good model for other conflicts in other areas around the world. Fidel Castro, I've met him a couple times, had a 5-hour lunch with him. He went through 2 interpreters.
And I gather he does have long lunches. So.
He has long lunches, he has long speeches, and his endurance factor is quite something. But he talks, 95%, and then the last 5%, what do you think? But it was very interesting. I mean, this is, an icon, if you will, even globally, but certainly within Cuba. But I think, it could go different angles on the meeting with him. But one of the things I've enjoyed most, obviously, was the request to use MTV and the music specifically to teach everyone in English. He professes 2 key messages. One is he has longevity, thanks to medical and literacy, and not only in Spanish, but he wants everyone to speak English. So he wanted music and MTV to teach the entire island English, and had the same thing in China. Met with Premier Jiang Zemin, and after tons of protocol in the Forbidden City, we sat down. The first words out of his mouth were MTV. And once again, using MTV music, really, not just in China, but around the world, to help people understand China better, which I thought was interesting.
How do you cope with issues of going global or going local, if you like, on a global level, when you're actually trying to go into countries like, for example, in the Middle East, and you have, the difficulty of establishing MTV Arabia, for example, where in some parts of the Middle East there are cultural, perhaps sometimes defined as religious, but usually cultural sensitivities towards music and pop videos and so on.
Well, it's a fine line, and we always don't get it right. By the way, we the history's littered with mistakes. Mostly mine. But we're very visible in the Islamic world now. It's quite something. We've been in Indonesia for, many years. We have Call to Prayer on the channel in Indonesia.
5 times a day.
5 times a day, and we do portrayal of Ramadan in a youthful way. So we have fun with it, but we respect it, of course. And all programmed locally, not by us in New York or London. And we're in India, obviously to a Muslim population. We've tried to bridge that gap between Pakistan and India with common concerts, Pakistanis and Indians on the same stage. We did an earthquake relief show, and for the first time collaborated, artists. The music is essentially the same, Urdu, but obviously because of the political differences, it's been very apart. Some countries, Pakistan didn't even allow Indian music at one point. So I was in Karachi in November, where we launched MTV Pakistan. We just added VH1 Pakistan. And also Turkey, again, fully localized, in this case Nickelodeon and MTV. And then the big one, this will be to potentially 35 million young Arabs from the start. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Egypt, UAE, really the whole region. So, the spotlight's on us. We really got to get this right. Cultural sensitivity is key. I was in Saudi last month, and, paying respect to everybody, describing our philosophy. The key is local. Not only local attitudes and local programming, but local people. Our partners and our management is all local. So they've got it. They got the region. They'll define it, I feel confident, in an appropriate way.
Now, I know from seeing you in so many countries that you are on the road, as you say, a lot of the time. Where does that leave you time for yourself?
Well, the lines are blurred, really. It's a dream to do something you love so much, so it's not considered a job. Sounds a little cliche, but I think it's true. So for me, it's my life, really. And I just try and fit my life into this mission, if you will. It certainly has defined me. The challenge for me personally is the family, because I was a late starter.
And you have 4 kids
I have
as well.
4 kids, and they're all below the age of 11, and I love them dearly, and I don't like being apart from them. I was apart from them and my wonderful wife this past weekend, so it's difficult, particularly on the weekends. I try and take them as much as possible, involve them as much as I can, but it's a tough one. That's a tough challenge.
Do you get any sort of quiet time though? Do you get downtime where you can actually just chill out and listen to the music?
Well, I do listen to music quite a bit, and I tend to tap into the music depending on where I am around the world, so I take it back with me. I drive my wife crazy, and I might listen to, I don't know, Mandarin music for a week or Mexican music for a week and just really, really go for it. My latest favorite is a Mongolian group. It has operatic and rap mixed in. I brought some music actually back from Saudi Arabia, the Jedi Legends, which is some of the best rap music I've heard anywhere in the world, from Saudi Arabia. Doesn't have the angry lyrics. It's actually more nurturing lyrics.
Yet.
Yeah. No, it's stress. I'm about ready to get married. What am I going to do? But there's one about his mother too. It's quite something, but it's great. It really is great. So, yeah, I think music offers a constant respite. But I think in the scheme of things, there is very little downtime, which is okay. I like the energy.
So what about the things you'd like to do, though, that you don't get a chance to? Is there anything outstanding that you would like to do?
Well, with these missions that we're on, we're not done. We have a lot of work to do on the epidemic of AIDS. Climate change, as I mentioned, has the potential to affect the entire world. It's reached a tipping point, I think, this issue more quickly than others. AIDS, it took, years, it seemed, for it to even be covered by the media. Now it is, of course, but the public seems to be ahead of the government and the institutions on climate change. So, I think that's a good thing. But behavioral change is a challenge. And what I always say, small pieces. With a network like MTV, which almost 2 billion people, small things on a large group of people, small behavioral change on a large group of people equals a big thing. So if everybody turns their light out, like a small number of the big audience, it's equal to a big thing. So, we can have an influence here. I still think we can go a long way on localizing our channels. Even though we're in 160 countries, we can go more vertical, and we can go more genre specific. So, even though we've got a great run, we're the biggest, I still think the growth is actually ahead of us. So there's a lot more to do.
Bill, I wish you luck. Thank you very much. Great talking with you.
Thank you, Riz. Thank you.